Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We're super excited to have the third lecture in our series. And I'm ML Vitas. I think someone's moving slides for me. Despite what it says on the screen, I'm not a board member of Energy Trust of Oregon. I work with Energy Trust of Oregon. I am, more importantly, a board member of Building a Better Bend. Building a Better Bend is a nonprofit organization founded nearly 20 years ago with the mission of bringing expert speakers to share their experience to positively affect the quality of development in Bend. Many of my fellow board members and past board members are in the audience this evening, and I'd like to ask them to stand so that you can see who these committed, passionate people are that bring us this lecture series. I think they're all actually greeting people. Yeah, so, yes, they're already standing. Thank you. And I would also like to take a moment to ask elected or appointed officials in attendance to please stand. I don't know who we might have. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here this evening. Our sponsors. Our free annual lecture series wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. When we envisioned a 3-part lecture series celebrating the 50th anniversary of Oregon's land use planning system, we were fortunate that First Interstate Bank immediately stepped up to be the title sponsor of the series. Their investment in our community is undeniable. We have a few members of the First Interstate team in the audience with us this evening. Please help me show our appreciation. We are also very fortunate to have Pinnacle Architecture as our presenting sponsor for tonight's lecture. Jessica Beal from Pinnacle is here to say a few words.
Thank you. As ML said, my name is Jessica. I'm an associate with Pinnacle Architecture. I'm speaking on behalf of Peter Bear, our founder. He is currently at an affordable housing conference in Portland, so I'm filling in. He's a Building a Better Bend board member and also a third-generation Bendite. It's so fun to listen to him talk about growing up in Bend and all the changes. He never complains about the growth, but always talks about the importance of smart growth and caring for everybody in our community. Pinnacle was founded 33 years ago on the mission of enhancing lives and communities. Today, we work all around Oregon on community-based projects. A few of our key projects here in Central Oregon is the Shepherd's House homeless shelter that's opening in Redmond in November, and Emily, of our project manager, is here today. Also, the Crook County Courthouse is under construction, and then a new permanent supportive housing project here in Bend. We're proud to be a sponsor of today's lecture and look forward to being part of Bend's wild future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and Pinnacle Architecture. Our supporting sponsors include Central Oregon Land Watch, LRS Architects, Miller Lumber, R&H Construction, and Cascadia Partners. Please help me thank these generous organizations. Additionally, we have a delightfully long list of partners. And I feel like we could play a little logo bingo. I'll call out the name, see if you can find their logo. We've got Taylor Brooks, Kittleson and Associates, CEA Consulting Engineers, Ashley and Vance, Crabtree Architecture and Design, HWA Project, Hand in Hand Productions, SunWest Builders, 10 Over Studio, Kelcon, Palmer Homes, KPFF, COIC, the City of Bend, Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, the Bend MPO, and Stimmich Design and Architecture. Thank you for all your support. If you'd like to see your logo on the screen next year, talk to one of us. We would be delighted to help you be a sponsor. I'm going to start off with a little background and then introduce our speakers and hand it over to them. So this is the final presentation in a 3-part lecture series examining the history of Oregon's land use laws. Like tonight's lecture, the first 2 were recorded. I encourage you to view those recordings even if you showed up in person. It's very interesting information in there. In lecture number 1, we looked back 50 years to the origins of our land use system. Jeff Mapes and Robert Liberty shared photos and stories from those early days of planning. Here's a quote from Robert Liberty. "For most governments, planning is a process that culminates in a plan. In Oregon, planning is a process that culminates in a place." The second lecture looked at our current land use laws and explored the possibilities in our built environment, now and over the next 25 years, looking more at our current land use system. Samya Kinney and Blaine Merker looked closely at some recent changes, including the new Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities program. They shared possible scenarios that could play out with our current land use laws. Here's a quote from Samya Kinney. "What we do in land use and what we do in development really matters for how people grow up and who they become and what they value." Tonight, we look out to the long horizon, 50 years from now. What factors do we need to consider as we plan for the future of Bend? What can we possibly do now to prepare? Think about it. What do you want your future self to say to you? Thanks or not so much? Our guest lecturer this evening is Tim Smith, principal of Sarah Architects, an architect, planner, and urban designer. Tim is the innovator of Civic Ecology, a planning framework. Some of his clients and projects include a new capital city for Abu Dhabi, framework planning for Google in Mountain View, California, urban design advisory services to the city of San Francisco for the Treasure Island redevelopment, and wildfire recovery planning for Greenville, California, and both Detroit and Gates, Oregon. In Bend, Tim led Sarah's work on the OSU Cascades Campus Master Plan. He has presented TEDx talks and is a winner of the Progressive Architecture Research Award. Joining Tim to provide context about the major long-term trends that will impact Oregon and Bend in the coming decades is Stephen Ames. Principal of NXT Consulting Group of Bend and Portland, Stephen is a consulting long-range planner and is currently consulting with Envision Bend's Bend Vision Project. He is a recipient of the Oregon APA Distinguished Leadership Award by a professional planner and, like me, a board member of Building a Better Bend. I'm going to hand it over to Stephen now.
Thanks, ML. Great. Looks like we've got the slides ready to go. I'm going to be using notes tonight when I'm talking because I'm going to be sharing a lot of facts and figures and data with you. So apologies that I can't stand up and talk without my notes in front of me. I'm honored to be here this evening to be Tim's opening act and to provide a little bit of context for some of the very visionary ideas that he's going to be talking about. In short, there's going to be a lot of change out there in the world, and it is calling upon us to think deeply about how we plan for the future of our own community. And let me see if I can do this. First, I want to talk about my favorite definition of the future, and this comes from a fellow who's based in Eugene. I'm forgetting his name right now. But his definition of the future is as follows: things getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. And it's very accurate. In a word, we are heading into a wild future full of amazing new advances, alarming developments, and all unfolding at record speed. In fact, now that we are almost quasi-post-pandemic, I would say that we are actually already living in that future. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Let's see if the clicker works here. Great. I'm going to give a bit of background on a number of trends of change and why they're important. And I'm going to start first by talking about global drivers of change, or what many futurists often call megatrends. Then I'm going to talk a bit about change at the national and regional level here in the Northwest, and how global trends are driving our future here in the Pacific Northwest. Next, I'll talk about a changing bend and what's happening here. And finally, time permitting, and I'm going to ask ML to be my timekeeper here if I go over, I'm going to end with some recent findings about how Bendites feel about change and about the future, and hopefully we'll make it to that. My mantra for these kinds of talks that I do is always this, is that global trends always equal local change. It's perhaps the most important that I will make tonight. Sadly, local communities tend to react to change after the fact, rather than anticipating and planning for change and preparing for it in advance. In other words, being proactive. Right off the top, I will say that IMHO, in my humble opinion, I think that our local governments and businesses, educational institutions, and community-based organizations here are at least on top of some of the change that we need to be responding to, and sometimes they're even out in front of it. And this is something that I have discovered in working on this document called the Environmental Scan, which was done for Envision Bend's Ben Vision project. It was a high-level survey of content of current and future trends that may impact the future of Greater Bend. In preparing this report, we reviewed some 300 sources from mainstream media, scholarly journals, policy institutes, and NGOs. And based on this research, we summarized key trends we think will have an impact on our future. And you can find the full report, the full environmental scan, at www.envisionbend.org. And I'll be mentioning Envision Bend a little bit more this evening as well, too. It should be said that this scan is now over 1 year old, and in the world of trends and change, that is a long time. Many of the facts and figures that are in that document are already becoming outdated, and I would say particularly and most notably in terms of climate change and artificial intelligence. In fact, the real news about ChatGPT did not even hit the media until after this report was done. That's how fast things are happening here. So let's go on to talk a little bit about global megatrends. And here is a rundown of a very big picture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into these trends. I think you'll all know them, but I do want to pose a question to you. As I walk through this list, and there are 8 of them, I am inviting you to think if you see evidence of the trends that are going to pop up on the screen here in Bend. In other words, this big global trend, do we feel the impact of that trend locally? So let's sort of play a little game. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. I'm just asking you to pay attention, and then we'll see how that works out. First, and most importantly, population growth, change, and migrations. This is probably the trend that we know the most about, that we have the most reliable data. Population forecasts are generally good between 15 to 20 years out. They're remarkably reliable in a more normal world, but that is also changing. The next trend of our global trend set of 8 is accelerated urbanization. The entire planet is in the process of urbanizing right now, and the United States is one of the most urbanized countries in the world. I think we're something like 85% urbanized now, and we are continuing to move in that direction. Next, no surprise to anyone, climate change, or climate crisis, if you prefer to call it that, and the environmental impacts that that's having on our world. Certainly, after breathing smoke from July to September here in Bend, we know that climate change is bearing down on us. Science, technology, and sustainability advances. There's lots of good news in this trend. There are a lot of amazing advances happening in terms of science and technology, but also some that are quite alarming. Not only at the global level, but regionally and locally as well, too. Global economic restructuring. You all know that we live in a global economy now, but since the pandemic, we've learned that the global economy itself is in the process of morphing. And much of the certainty that we felt existed with what's called that international order is less than certain today, in part because of the pandemic and also the war that we're seeing in Europe happening right now. Economic inequality and social injustice happening across the planet. We're becoming more and more aware of how unequal our societies are, and particularly between the global north and the global south, or developing countries and the less developed countries. Public health challenges. This is one of the megatrends that's newer on the list, and I would say that the pandemic really elevated this in our awareness that we are very vulnerable to major, large-scale world changes. I was just reading this afternoon about TB possibly being the next global pandemic, which was rather alarming to hear. And finally, and this is one of the ones that's most interesting and fascinating to me, I won't have much time to talk about it tonight, but it is shifting values and cultural and civic norms. And it's happening not just in our country, but around the world, and particularly in the democratic nations of the industrial nations. So those are the global 8. I'm just kind of curious, and maybe a raise of your hands if you see evidence of all or most of these trends here happening in Bend. Everybody? Okay, and for everybody out in streaming land, a lot of hands went up. And that's my point. Now, the other thing I want to say, and this is one thing that people don't think a lot about, that futurists do talk about. There are not only trends of change that are out there happening, there are what we call global catalysts. One-off events, or sometimes longer events that happen that tend to magnify or amplify the impact of global change. And here they are. Number 1, extreme weather and natural disasters. The statistics on this, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, excuse me, are pretty dramatic. Potential future pandemics. Most health experts are saying is like, fasten your seatbelts. We will see more pandemics in the future of different kinds than what we've been experiencing over the last 2 to 3 years. Global economic volatility. Certainly the pandemic itself caused a lot of disruptions in the global supply chains. We all realize that it's more vulnerable than we thought it might be. Authoritarian regimes and fringe political movements. It's happening around the world. It's happening in democratic nations, and it's happening in less developed nations as well too. And finally, geopolitical conflicts, war. There are now, I believe, 5 wars happening on the planet, at least the last time I talked, defined as major war if there are more than 10,000 casualties happening, and there are conflicts happening across the globe. This is the wild future that we're talking about. And I don't want to dwell too much on the dark and gloomy side of it. It's easy to get caught up, particularly if you're just listening every day to the barrage of news. But inside these trends, there are a lot of opportunities and possibilities. And certainly, Tim is going to talk a lot about those tonight. Now, I want to zoom in from the global context to the Pacific Northwest. And in my opinion, the Northwest where we live is very much a reflection of global trends. By the way, if you can't detect it, if you look at the center of this image of the Pacific Northwest, down towards the center of the bottom of the screen, you will see Mount Bachelor and the Three Sisters, just above the word Northwest. So just wanted to point that out. While all the hang on just a second here. I want to make sure this advances for me. Great. So what we're going to do tonight, because in the interest of time again, I'm just going to focus on 4 of those global trends, how they're impacting the Northwest region, because these are those trends which I think have the most impact on how we plan and develop our communities for the future. So the first one I want to cover is global growth, change, and migration. And here in the United States, we are still growing, but slower than we used to do. There is a leveling off of trends, but the cessation of adding to our population is not going to happen for several more decades. There's a so-called California diaspora happening, meaning that people leaving the state of California for a variety of reasons. It's too expensive, the taxes are too high, it's too crowded, whatever that reason is, and they're moving into other places, both in the Southwest and in the Pacific Northwest. There are a number of different types of voluntary migrations happening. There are lifestyle seekers. Frankly, people with money who can choose to live wherever they want to live, whether it's in Bozeman, Montana, or Boise, Idaho, or Bend, Oregon, and that is definitely a trend. There are so-called equity bandits, people who cash out from their 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath, $2.5 million ranch home in Mountain View or elsewhere, and buy, you know, a lot of house for a lot less money here in Bend or elsewhere. And equity bandits is what some people snarkily call them. Millennials are moving. Interestingly, millennials are tending to move out of the center cities into the suburbs because they're starting families. They want a patch of lawn in the back for the kids to run and play. And it's changing the nature of our suburbs. It's definitely happening in the Portland metro area. And finally, Zoom workers. And one of the most interesting things is that we really have a lot of Zoom workers here in Bend, as you know. Bend is one of all the small cities in the United States, is one of the most preferred for Zoom workers who wish to work remotely. They want to live in Bend so they can work in California, Seattle, or wherever. So that's population growth, migrations, and change and migration. Let me see if this can get this to advance. It's not wanting to advance for me. Matt, if you could advance the slide. There we go. Accelerated urbanization. We mentioned earlier that urbanization is happening around the world, but it's really happening in the United States. We are now, urban areas now account for about 86% of the American population. So we are a very urbanized society, and that trend will continue. Between 2001 and 2019, in other words, the first 2 decades roughly of the 21st century, 14,000 square miles were developed for urban purposes. That is the size of New Jersey and Connecticut combined. Think of it, a city the size of New Jersey and Connecticut has happened in the last 2 decades. US housing units also grew, but the number of housing units being built has actually declined from a decade ago. And we see that happening now in terms of housing prices and availability. And from the average median price of homes has also skyrocketed, as you know. In July of this year, we hit $800,000 for the median list price of a house in Bend, Oregon, much higher than Portland, I will say. Okay, the next one I want to or discuss is the, let's see if this works, there we go, is climate and environmental impacts. And this gets pretty bleak here in the Northwest. Drought, 60% of the American West is in exceptional or extreme drought. Less than 1% of the West is not affected by drought currently. There are reductions in snowpack, meaning lowered stream flows. Soil moisture levels in the Northwest are drier than they have been in 99 years. Water is another issue. We had last year, as you will know, the first ever official declared water shortage in the United States. Oregon was not included in that, even though we are, and most of us are, Oregon counties are in drought. But the southwestern states were put on notice that they have to begin conserving water. And wildfire. From 2011 to 2020, an average of 7.5 million acres burnt in the United States, most of it in the American West. So fire obviously has become a big issue. The last trend that I want to talk about and its impact on the Northwest is science, technology, and sustainability. And here, as I said, there is some good news. First of all, the leaps in technology are mind-boggling. Quantum computing, cloud computing, blockchain technology, AI, augmented reality, the list goes on. It's pretty stunning when you think about it. Also, particularly beginning with the pandemic and accelerating, our personal reliance on technology has increased in our workplaces, in education, in healthcare, shopping and commerce, even our personal interactions. We've all become much more dependent on these technologies. There are opportunities out there for smarter cities, I think some of which Tim might talk about. And medical breakthroughs, more flexible workplaces, but there are also challenges in terms of jobs being eliminated, disinformation, cybercrime, and the big unanswered question is, what will AI do to our society? This is something we're still learning a lot about. And finally, sustainability advances. This is really the good news piece. The advances in renewable energy technologies, advanced batteries, carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, all those things offer an incredible opportunity for our society as we look to meeting climate change goals. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this section is, again, catalyst. And I have a couple graphics here. I apologize for the one on the left. It's a little hard to read, which is really looking at average temperatures in the United States. And you'll see a little arrow and a dot in the upper right-hand corner. That is a one-off event. That was the 2021 heat dome in the Pacific Northwest when the recorded temperature in British Columbia approached 124 degrees. It is the single most anomalous climate event in the history of global weather recording, bar none. And it happened here in the Northwest. Now, it was an anomaly, but the climate change connection there is quite appropriate. And the graph on the map on the left shows projections for properties with significant risk of wildfire in the year 2052, or 50 years out from when this projection was made. And you can see it looks pretty alarming in the West and in the Pacific Northwest too. I think you probably can even see the little boot of Deschutes County in there if you look closely. Last, I'm going to now talk about planning for growth and change in Bend. And the one thing I will say is that it is very hard to find a lot of data on trends information for local communities. There's just not that much. Certainly population forecasts and transportation data and things like that. But other than that, there's not a lot. So what we did in preparing this section is look more at what's actually happening in Greater Bend right now. And I want to go through that right now. In terms of sustained population and change, man, we are growing. For over 400% since 1990, Bend has grown in its population. 23,000 more people in the next 7 years, and that's a city forecast. It may have been updated since the last time I looked. 166,000 residents by the year 2047. We're at about 104,000 right now. So we are definitely growing. Our population is also aging and diversifying. The fastest growing groups in the Bend area are people between 20 and 29, and no surprise, people between 60 and 69. And our Latino population is also expanding. Currently, right now, we're approaching 9% Latino population, which surprises a lot of people when you mention that stat. In terms of urbanization, this is where I think we have quite a lot of success happening. I mean, the whole point of this lecture series is to talk about the history of land use planning and how it has been used to make better communities, more livable communities in Oregon. And I think I don't need to go back and repeat that. But now, as the city approaches looking at its next update of its comprehensive plan, we are already in the process of thinking ahead and preparing for that plan. And for those of you who don't follow, we currently have 10 UGB expansion areas on the periphery of the city that have been flagged for potential future urban development, and 9 opportunity areas in the city, including right here in the Bend Central District. And I think it's those areas of opportunity that are the most exciting because they offer the greatest opportunity for higher density, more urban living that can really address some of the population statistics I've just described. Transportation plans, I really do need to move through this quickly. We do have a large, as you know, affordable housing challenge. Bend is the least affordable major city in the state of Oregon. As of July of this year, 14% of households in Bend could afford to buy a median listed home price in Bend, 14%. And that, among all major cities in Oregon, is the most alarming, I think. I think that's all I'm going to say on that one. Finally, on climate action, there's a lot happening here too, but there's a lot to be worried about. Drought, wildfire, and smoke. We've all been through that for the last 3 months here this summer, so we know firsthand what that is all about. At the same time, there's a lot happening, particularly in the city of Bend, in terms of climate action. There's the climate action plan. The city is looking at wildfire protection, water conservation, even deployment of EV charging stations. So there's a lot of thinking happening in the city now. But there are gaps as well, too. Our policies are really oriented towards mitigation, minimizing our own impact on climate, but not so much on adaptation and resilience, which really are the buzzwords of people who are involved in climate change. Also, the Solarizing Bend initiative of the Environmental Center is a major development happening. I'm going to quickly wrap up here. Am I doing all right for time, ML? Okay, great. Also, on science and technology, I do want to do a shout out on that too. This is also, I think, very interesting and encouraging news for the Bend area. Our tech economy is very vibrant. It is a growing sector that is really helping diversify our economy. As our regional economist for the Bend area, Damon Runberg, says, the structure of our economy now is closer to San Diego than it is to the historical structure of Bend's economy, timber and railroads and logging and all that. We have really changed into a very modern economy, and technology is a very big part of it. There are more than 100 tech-enabled companies in Central Oregon right now. OSU Cascades has its new Innovation Co-Lab, a new 24-acre innovation district that is just about to begin its construction that will include facilities for tech enterprises, light industrial, office, even workforce housing is going to be included in that development over there. So it's really quite encouraging to see. And finally, also remote workers and co-working spaces. We are a very vibrant community for that. So technology is part of our future, and I think we need to think about how does that economy connect with planning for a better community. And Tim has a fabulous story to tell about one of his projects in California that he's worked on that. I'm just going to quickly rack up here and mention a few things for you to pay attention to. And in the Bend Vision project, one of the things we did was a community survey where we had over 2,000 people. It was around 2,050 people took the survey. I'm sure some of you did as well too. And in this, they talked about what they felt were the biggest challenges for the future of Bend: population growth and development, declining affordability, rising impact of climate change, infrastructure improvements, and on. Everything that I've just talked about in terms of trends, the people of Bend understand what those challenges are. And I find it I always like to say, if there's any one person who's smarter than any of us, it's all of us. And I have been very encouraged to see what Bendites are talking about and thinking about when it comes to the future. Just a quick overview of what people are calling for in that survey: strategically planned growth, investing in bikeways and pathways, promoting more walkable neighborhoods or complete communities, as the city calls it, revitalizing the Bend Central District where we are. This is very progressive stuff. It makes me so proud that we can have a virtual meeting with 2,000 people, and they can say stuff like this. Gives me such hope in the future of our city. They also, on the environment, another area that affects planning for the future, conserving and protecting our urban forest and native trees. Purchasing and preserving skyline forest is huge. And as you know, that's really underway. Developing an interconnected regional trail system, acquiring open space, expanding mental health and substance abuse programs. Interestingly seen as an element of a safe and healthy environment is the mental health of our population. So I'm going to end with just one more slide, and this is kind of a plug for Envision Bend and its Vision Action Plan, which will be released on Friday. And you can go to the Envision Bend website, www.envisionbend.org, and download your copy of the plan. And I think when you read it, you will find that many of the 28 strategies that are in there reflect not only what the people of Bend told us in our survey, but what we have looked at in terms of challenges facing our community. The one last thing I will say is that this is a 5-year plan. So it's really looking out, even though our vision is longer term, the plan is really focused on the next 5 years. Now, I'm going to turn the mic over to Tim, because he's going to talk about the 45 years after that and some of the really cool things that we can do. No pressure there, Tim.
No.
I'm going to hand over the clicker to you. Thanks very much.
I'm glad you ended on those positive notes. At the beginning, I was beginning to think about that famous quote by Satchel Paige, the great pitcher: "Never look behind you because something might be gaining on you." And it kind of felt like that. I almost didn't want to know some of that stuff. And maybe some of you didn't want to know that either. No, that's okay. Somebody has to say it. So let me, what I'm going to do is, before I launch into this, I have 4 sections to this. The first one is actually a little bit of context, which has a little bit of trends, also kind of nasty stuff, but I'm going to really minimize that and move into some big ideas. And then I want to focus on, I think, 3 areas that are really, you guys did well in choosing these as a focal point, which is transforming suburbs, beginning to think about resilience and getting ahead of disasters by being resilient, and then talking about 21st century infrastructure and what that could be all about. So here we go. And maybe. Okay, you guys back there. Yeah, click in the middle. But there we go. Okay, so let's start with the first part, context here. So there's this thing called an ecological footprint. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, but it takes into account all the things that we consume and do in our lives, whether agriculture, forest products, transportation, materials we use for building. And it combines them into one big thing called an ecological footprint. And it helps scientists and others begin to get a sense of what kind of impact humans are having on our planet. I guess you really have to hold this thing, don't you? Oh, you have to press and release it. Okay. So I can see my daughter watching this and saying, "Dad," everyone knows that. So here's a graph of up until about 2018 of our ecological footprint as a species. And what you can see is when you add up all those elements that comprise an ecological footprint, so time on the bottom and the number of planets on the left, what you'll see is that sometime in 1970, our footprint exceeded the capacity of the Earth to deal with us. And so we have been, up until then, we were living on capital. Now we're living on fumes. And, okay. Now I got it. Okay. So if you were to project out that graph to 2050, what you would find is that we need 5.3 Earths. The last time I looked, we only had 1.0 Earths. This is a problem, and it's beyond a math problem. It's a problem that we all need to breathe into here. So there's a lot of conversation going on about net zero emissions, and basically all that is doing is telling us that what we need to do is get back to one planet living by the year 2050. And you can see that is a pretty precipitous decline in virtually everything that impacts our lives in terms of things we do, things we consume. So we have we, all of us, no matter where we live, have a pretty steep hill to climb here. And hopefully it's a steep hill to go down. So Stephen, you were right. In the United States, we're about 87% urbanized. The world is about 60%. So what does that mean? And I want to do a little caveat here because, yes, during the pandemic, some people relocated from cities to urban areas, and you can see the blue areas are the areas that received people, and the orange areas lost urban populations. But still, I imagine we're well above 80% urban. And the significance of that is that cities, thank goodness, tend to be one of our best strategies for combating a lot of these really nasty trends. And why is that? Well, in a city, the most efficient use of land possible for housing us, we can share resources. We have access to a sense of community and to a lot of markets, and I don't just mean supermarkets, but I mean markets for goods, shopping, all of those kinds of things. Also, cities historically have been the location for the innovation of ideas. Transportation tends to be denser in cities, and it's a great opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint. Obviously, cities are helping us preserve the natural world around us and providing less pressure on agriculture and forestry resources. So cities are really kind of a strategy that we ought to be breathing into. Fortunately, you have a wonderful city here, and you have a wonderful group of people who get this and are working on this. So I feel really good about where Bend is going, despite all those nasty trends that you showed us, Stephen. So, but the cities in the 21st century, we need to think about them differently. And one of my personal heroes is Jane Jacobs, who I actually got to meet. She signed, my wife and I have every single book she ever wrote, and she signed every single one of them for us. So they are now collector's items, probably. But she said something in The Death and Life of Great American Cities about the type of problem and opportunity that a city is. And as you can see, it's a problem and an opportunity in organized complexity, which is really what we're talking about. We're entering an era of complexity, and if we can figure out how to organize it in a way that we can benefit from it, cities are the way to do that. And so what she really is saying here is that there are many variables, but cities have figured out a way to interrelate them into an organic whole. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the holistic approach to designing cities. And so what that tells you is that we need to stop thinking about cities as linear consumption conveyor belts for resources, right? Where we consume virgin materials, and when we're done with them, we throw them away. As we're finding out, there is no such place as a way anymore. A way is here in our own communities. And so what we need to do is be thinking about a more circular approach to designing cities and all of the systems that help animate our cities in the future. And so what that also tells us is in the future, you here in Bend, and actually everyone everywhere, we're going to be thinking about carbon impacts of everything we do. And this is just a little blurb about the design professions, the planning and design professions, and how embodied carbon will really be a big deal. When you're designing buildings in the next 50 years, it's not just the materials and how they look, but where they came from, what they're comprised of, what kind of community they came from. All of these things have impacts on embodied carbon, and then how we operate them once they're actually built is another problem indeed. So you can see that carbon in buildings is just one layer. We're not even talking about transportation systems or agriculture. So those of us really concerned with building cities of the future really need to be thinking about carbon and all its manifestations. And so we're going to need different kinds of tools to do planning, design, and urban design. And this is a tool that we've been using on a number of projects. We call it the Project Compass. And what it does is it really looks at all the various factors. It's sort of like a holistic picture of everything you should consider when you're designing either a building, a neighborhood, a city, a region. And then it begins to ask the question of the stakeholders, do we want to be in that bullseye, which is business as usual, or do we want to aspire to something that begins to move beyond business as usual? And it puts everyone on notice that if we agree to this, this is how we're going to make decisions in the future about how we're going to move forward on various concepts. We also need to be paying much more attention to the natural forces around us. If our future is going to be driven by the sun, that means that solar orientation, wind impacts, we really need to start paying attention to these much more than we have in the past. And so the end of the mechanistic era and the beginning of the holistic era is going to have us looking at a lot of these things much more closely than we ever did before. And so this is a little animation here, but the idea is that, you know, in the past, a lot of us who are designers, I won't speak for you guys at Pinnacle, I'll speak for folks that in my firm and elsewhere that I know about. We really have been thinking about physical design and physical context, and that's kind of what constitutes the project. But in the future, I like to call that the hardware axis. And in the future, I think we're going to have to be adding another axis, which has to do with resource flows, energy, water, waste, food systems, local economy, where money flows, and the local culture that helps to animate the flows of those systems. I like to call that the software axis. And if this is all about placemaking, which I think you referred to, Stephen, then in order to really design successful places for the next 50 years, we need to be considering all of these things, not just the physical environment. And so the other thing, so along the bottom is the ecological footprint of the various rating systems, and we in the design and planning professions are aware of LEED rating systems, Living Building Challenge, and thankfully we're beginning to move beyond those. They served a purpose, which was to enlighten development community, the construction community, about how we need to be moving into the green era. I think a lot of those green rating systems are really talking about doing things less bad. We've all agreed that that's not good anymore, as you saw from those graphs. So we need to start thinking about more good. I don't think that's proper grammar, but you know what I'm talking about. We need to be moving into restorative buildings, regenerative communities, things of that nature. The good news is that there is now money. The financial world is beginning to realize that traditional investing is now where the risk is. And I'm part of a small startup, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which so I'm beginning to deal with finance people, and I have now a whole new level of sympathy for developers that I never had before. I know what you guys go through, you men and women, and I'm in the midst of it now. So ESG investing, investing that's consistent with environmental, social, and good governance goals is now becoming something, but that's also less bad, not more good. And so what we're beginning to look at in our resilience work is impact investing, and there are a lot of sources out there now for the types of capital that we in the design professions have dreamed about over the last 30 to 50 years, and even into regenerative investing, where people are looking at how do we move beyond net zero to something that's actually much better than net zero. So good news, yes, we're going to be relying on green buildings, and we're still going to be pushing the envelope on them. We're going to be relying on smart infrastructure, and we're going to be pushing the envelope on those. But what if the best infrastructure in the future was you all? What if people working in their community on systems that they design is really the answer to the future of 21st century infrastructure? Here's a group of kids, and they are working on a school garden, community garden that they designed. Likewise, here's a bioswale that they're learning about. And I'll show you some folks in a community that we did some work in Portland taking this challenge on. The challenge was, don't talk about buildings, talk about systems. We want you to design your future energy, your future water, your waste systems, your food systems, your local economy before you start thinking about buildings. And so you can see they are playing a game, we call it civic ecology. And at the end of it, what happens is you actually create integrated food systems. You can also create housing systems. This one in particular came from some work we did in Detroit, Michigan, where we had a bombed out community, and the folks in the neighborhood were really concerned that once it came back, they wouldn't be able to afford to live there anymore. And so we helped them envision a housing land trust system that would enable them to actually be long-term residents of their community, and that even they could bequeath their community to their children. And so what it also says is that maybe a different way of working is, public is important, private's important, but maybe there's a new piece of this which is called the civic public-private, which is where you all come in, right? If you are now part of the infrastructure, a civic public-private partnership may be the way of the 21st century in the next 50 years. And so I'm going to take you through these three areas: transforming the suburban, and again, applying some of these ideas to disaster resilience and recovery, and a new model for infrastructure. So, suburban. And why is transforming suburban important? Well, for all those reasons that I gave about why cities are our best tools, here they are. A more efficient land utilization than you find in suburbs. Shared resources, more proximate community, increased walkability and resulting public health, better market for ideas, reduced carbon impact, on and on and on. And what we're finding from some developers now is enhanced revenue generation from greater density and a greater attention paid to walkability. So the first project, you may have heard of this client. It's called Google. When we first started working with them, you might not have heard of them because we started working with them probably about 12-ish, maybe more years ago. And their campus in Mountain View doesn't look like this. This is what it's gonna look like, but it was basically a sea of parking. And so we sat down with them and we said, you have an opportunity here. You're one of the wealthiest corporations in the world to not just do a bunch of suburban office buildings in parking lots, but to really rethink the idea of a working, living community. And so we got them to think about their relationship to the Bay, to open space, to development. And what we did is we came up with not a master plan, but a framework plan, something that's, we like to say, long life, loose fit, because a company like Google is changing every year or so. And so the last thing they need is a master plan that they need to adhere to for the next 10 or 20 years. And so what we did is we said to them, you have a problem on Highway 101 because it's congested and the city of Mountain View is not going to let you grow very much. What if you started to design housing in your campus and actually created a mixed-use community? What if you created a village? What if you created a town that your employees could actually walk to? And after deciding they weren't going to fire us for having a really stupid idea, the city planning group, who was one of the most forward-thinking I've ever encountered, said, yeah, Google, what if you did that? And so over the course of time, they began to realize that this might be the way to go. And so a sea of parking became a 3.4-mile green loop, green system, with a whole bunch of density, some of it office space, some of it housing. And I can tell you right now, and we helped them get entitlement for 10,000 housing units, and I can tell you right now they are really happy about that, because not a lot of people want to come to work anymore, and they have a lot of land, and they could be building a heck of a lot of housing in an area, Silicon Valley, which needs a heck of a lot of affordable housing, and so that's kind of what's happening. But part of what we envisioned for them is a mixed-use village that their employees and the public would really enjoy being in, and not having to fight through traffic, perhaps even a main street with mixed use, housing on top, restaurants, office space. It's all mixed together. And here's an example of a parking lot that we helped them transform into a green loop, which features bicyclists, walkers, all kinds of really interesting modes of transportation, and a biophilic natural habitat along the side of it, and some really great meeting spaces, which are really kind of open to the public. And so what we then are helping them do in nearby Middlefield Park is take smaller sections that are really gray. Look at that slide. Everything's gray. And so what we're doing is helping them turn everything green. So taking what was going to be a suburban office park and turning it into a mixed-use community. It is at a light rail station. This station was historically one of the least used stations on the least used line in the entire Bay Area. And the idea is to really get that thing rocking so that it begins to connect to San Jose and San Francisco. And look at the statistics here, though. On the left, how much parking there was and how much open space there was, the two circles at the bottom. And look on the right. There's hardly any space devoted to parking, and look at all that open space. This is the kind of place that people really want to live in now, and developers are willing to invest in. I'm telling you, Bend, this is not just a Silicon Valley trend. Their median household income or household cost is $1.5 million last time I looked. So they're kind of desperate. You guys are getting there. So I'm just telling you. The other thing, at a building scale, so we have to stop thinking about purpose-built buildings. This is a building that's going to begin its life as a parking garage, and as parking becomes less necessary, the skin is designed to be removed, and it could be office, it could be housing, it could be both. But the point is, it's not just going to be parking forever. And here's something that we're working on in Bozeman, Montana, population 55,000, approximately half of Bend. And again, the idea of converting a really significant part of their urban fabric into something that's much more walkable than it ever has. So the developers decided they wanted to use this little compass wheel idea we had in collaboration with the surrounding community. So all the stakeholders got together and figured out what they wanted to prioritize. And as a result, they got this very walkable community that is currently under construction in beautiful Bozeman, which has now become also a high-tech hub in Montana. Who would have thought it 10 years ago? In Bend, in Eugene, closer to home, you may be familiar with the riverfront in Eugene, which is so sort of disconnected from downtown and even the campus. And we're now doing some work on the so-called eWebsite to connect this area to downtown through pedestrian-oriented streets. And you can see the idea, and this is also under construction now. So just the idea that we really need to begin greening our cities as we go forward. Finally, here's all the sort of significant catchment areas for really large shopping malls in the United States. These things are just sitting there waiting to be turned into something else like this. So here's something that we're helping a developer do now, which is to add housing to one end of it, keep some of the limited amounts of parking, and then the parking for the housing will be underneath it, and transform the mall into kind of a mixed-use Main Street. This may look radical right now, but in the next 50 years, this is really where we're going to be going. And hey, how about this? Jack Straw in Bend. This is happening right here in Bend, not too far away from here, the idea of taking underused urban fabric and beginning to connect it. And what we're really happy about here is that yellow thing down there, which is going to be a Dutch Woonerf. And this is a project that we're doing in our office. And our one of my Dutch colleagues is so proud of this. He feels like he's bringing his culture to Bend. So disaster resilience and recovery. Here we are. Resiliency, what is it? Protect, adapt, regenerate. So our goal here is to empower communities at all scales to get ahead of disasters. And here are some of the things that we just need to be thinking about in terms of resilience. Resilience to what? Environmental hazards, human-caused hazards, infrastructure loss, business and community, all of these things. We're all at risk for many of these things. But why now? Well, we as you can see, there are a number of climate impacts, social issues that Stephen mentioned. A lot of these things are out there. And so we need to be thinking about how to make our communities more resilient to these things in the future. The value is to enable business continuity, asset protection, all of these things, protection of natural resources. This is really important. If you remember one thing from what I say tonight is this idea that you need to get on top of resilience. And here's why. As you know, there have been a number of wildfire incidents in Oregon. We did some pro bono work in the city formerly known as Talent. As you can see, what it used to look like. It's still there. We did a lot of research for them to help them think about how they could, what do they need to know in order to rebuild? It would have been great for them to know what they needed to rebuild before they had a disaster, but that didn't happen. And so, a lot of lessons learned along the way that you can't just go out and be resilient. You've got to think about your local history, your local culture. There are a lot of really wonderful ideas out there, fire-wise landscaping and construction, that when you embark on this, you're going to become aware of, because they're really important. The idea of having certain facilities in your community be centrally located and impervious to disasters as much as possible, so they can be central gathering places. And finally, redundant routes so people can still get around in a disaster, really important. Talent now has all these things that they're working on, a little bit too late, but they have them. So now I want to show you a community we're working on in the Dixie wildfire area. And hold your breath. I want you to be prepared for what you're going to see here. This is the day that Greenville, California, population 1,100 was completely destroyed. It was a really traumatic day for them. This community, I'm told by the folks who witnessed it, it completely burned down in 45 minutes. 45 minutes. The winds changed and it was gone. And so they had us come down and help them really work with, at first they wanted to just rebuild. And we started doing some pretty deep questioning and some of this deep resource flow work. And now their goal is to become the most resilient small town in America and to become a model for all small towns in rural America, and to become a model for please do this before you have a disaster. And so I'm hoping this hits home to everyone who's watching. The most wonderful group of people you could ever imagine to work with. And the first thing they did was to form the Dixie Fire Collaborative, which is a conglomeration of some major stakeholders, the county, the city of Evergreen, the Caltrans, which is a big one. And if only they had done that ahead of time, maybe they could have all worked on resilience planning, but they didn't. So here it is, and sharing resources amongst all these different groups is really important, ensuring that there are supplies that can come after a disaster. This is all really crucial things. So we did the community flow mapping, civic ecology work, which really put them in charge and made them central to the future infrastructure of their community. And they have to rethink everything, not just the buildings, the zoning, design guidelines, but their utilities as well. And so we led them through a whole variety of categories, and they were really champs at really having the spirit of rethinking their entire community. They worked towards shared goals, they mapped their resources, they prioritized projects. They're actually building some of them now. They really got into the complexity of what it's going to be like to design a city in the 21st century with everything that's going on. And they're beginning to think about changing policy right now at all levels. And we asked them some pretty powerful questions, which you are going to need to ask yourself if you go down this resilience road. Here they are. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? How do we know if we're getting there? In other words, how do we measure progress? And Who wants to volunteer and help us find out? Those folks came up with a wonderful community food system. Every single community we work in at the very deep systems level now, the number one thing is food, and the number one component is a brew pub. I cannot figure that out. It must be a West Coast thing. I don't know. So the last thing I'm going to say in this section is the idea of a resilience hub. So this is a thing that begins with battery storage and a microgrid, so that whenever there's a time when the grid goes out for whatever reason, if you're hooked up to this thing, your power is still good. And oh, by the way, this building could also have a warming center, and a cooling center, a community kitchen, maybe a health center in case there are injuries. Maybe it could even be converted into a mini medical clinic. There's a whole variety of things that during a disaster it could function as, but day to day, it could just be a community center. You could hook it onto a library. Imagine if every neighborhood in Bend had a resilience hub. That would help get you a long way toward building community and also being much more resilient. So the last thing is new models for infrastructure. So we did some work at Google, as I mentioned, and various other places, and we began to investigate the different types of technology that are going to become really important in the 21st century if we're going to get back to one planet living, and they're listed down here. And then we asked the question, at what scale do they all optimize? And what's interesting is that if you were going to use all of these things together, they would optimize at what we label a campus scale, but it's really 10,000 people, which is roughly the scale of an urban neighborhood. And so that began to suggest to us that the best way to approach future infrastructure is at the neighborhood scale. Okay, not the whole city, not the whole region, but the neighborhood scale. And so this idea of high-performance neighborhoods was born, and you really need to begin to focus at the neighborhood scale. So a high-performance neighborhood, geographically defined district, where community members, buildings, and common infrastructure are fully integrated. So this idea of a holistic place, supporting a network of sustainable social, ecological, and economic systems. Whole systems thinking here. And so, neighborhoods are going to be unique to a place. This is one in Sweden. Obviously, if you do one of these high-performance neighborhoods here in Bend, it's not going to look like that. It's going to have your beautiful landscape in it. Energy and water are localized. Okay. Resource flows are human-scaled, and they're actually designed by the folks who live in these places as active and really members of strong democracy. This is really as much about better democracy, grassroots democracy, as it is about the infrastructure that comes out of it. Alternative mobility options are the norm. Walking, riding a bike, all kinds of things that oftentimes get neglected. Encourages participation not only of people in the landscape, but also in the process of creating the landscape and the systems that are going to, animate these places in the future. Here's an example: Hammarby Sjöstad in Sweden, where they have done many of these things, and they started with their systems. So what you look here, if you were to untangle all these resource flows, you would find energy, you would find water, you would find waste systems, and you would find the idea of eliminating the concept of waste, the concept formerly known as waste, like Prince. So, and you really have to begin to think about neighborhoods as a bundle of resource flows before you should be designing the buildings and the parks and the streets. This is a fundamental rethink, I think. And you end up with really cool things like waste systems that look like this and have an underground component that's vacuumed and, all kinds of really zoomy kinds of things. But you don't get to integrated systems like this unless you really think about them from the very beginning. So the good news is that here in Bend, the OSU Cascades campus, which I had the joy of touring today, I hadn't been back there since we finished the master plan a number of years ago. But this district systems concept is alive and well and living on that campus. Here's a view of the campus, the tech hub along the right, and then the actual academic campus, and then where the two meet at that wonderful plaza we hope gets built pretty soon, and the idea of energy distribution and undergrounding everything and solar driven, the idea of a complete water infrastructure. So I think you all kind of get this. Here's a cross section through the campus. I understand the geo exchange didn't happen in exactly that form, but it's going to happen. And so this is really good news. There's a precedent here in Bend for what I like to call this 21st century infrastructure. So that leads me to what I alluded to at the very beginning, this little venture that it's actually an adventure. So I'm now an infrastructure developer, and we're beginning to think about how to bundle energy, thermal, water, mobility, and digital systems into something that begins to support an entire urban neighborhood, as you can see right there. And so we're calling it an infracenter, a stack of utilities providing zero carbon energy, thermal, wastewater, digital, and last mile mobility solutions at the district scale, anything from 5 to 50 acres. That thing's going to just keep going, so I'll move here. Our first project is in the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry campus in downtown Portland on the Willamette River. And you can see on the left, right now it's a museum surrounded by asphalt, and the idea is that it'll be a master planned mixed-use community with this integrated infrastructure system on it. And this really, we didn't just dream this up. Actually, OMSI, Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, dreamed this up. They had some very aggressive sustainability goals. And we said to them, the only way we're going to meet this is about thinking about this completely differently in an integrated way. And so that's where this idea was born. And you can see arrayed around there all kinds of really interesting things like net positive water, net zero carbon. We even had a crazy idea that this would be what's the term when you're burning gas? Ignition free. There'd be nothing burned in the district. And I remember the OMSI project manager at the time said, well, I want to have a gas stove. And we said, not in your district, you're not. He didn't like that too much. He's not there anymore. So, what comprises this? Well, energy systems, so the idea of a microgrid, really important. And we are partnering with Portland General Electric on this as we speak. And they have a mandate to decarbonize the grid in the Portland area and also add resilience to the grid. So this is perfect for what they need to be doing. A district thermal systems, and we use the example of the one here at OSU Cascades. Water systems, and there's many examples now of constructed wetlands, of bioreactors like the image in the middle, which is from Hasselo on 8th in the Lloyd District in Portland, which basically takes waste and churns them and turns them into things that aren't waste anymore, but nutrient with value. Mobility systems, the idea is we're going to create, one of the big ideas, we're not sure how we're going to pull this off yet, but is to do a parking garage that can be convertible to housing and office space and feature significant EV charging in there. So buses, a lot of school buses for kids and such at OMSI. And so could they be all electrically run? At some point, we would love to, first of all, downsize the garage and begin to convert it into housing and office, and then maybe only allow electric vehicles in there. I bet you that would be really popular. And then finally, digital systems. The idea that someday in the future, where the heck is my phone? It was supposed to be a prop. Anyway, hold up your phone. Someday you might be able to control all of your utility systems from your smartphone. no matter where you are, not just energy, but water. You can figure out how to get to where you need to go on transit. There's a whole variety of things. You can pay your bill, all of it. And so we're trying to figure it out, and we're partnered with a entrepreneur who helped bring Disney into the digital age. So we think we're probably in pretty good hands with this character as a partner. But the idea of really harnessing the power and the impact of digital systems. So I have one last slide, and I want to preface this last slide by saying that sometimes at night I wake up in a cold sweat, and it's my great, 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 great grandchildren talking to me. And they're asking me, what have you been doing to help make the world a better place so that when we come along, we have a real place to live in? And so I talk to them in the middle of the night. My wife says, are you okay? And I say, and so I want to leave you with a poem by my favorite poet, Gary Snyder, for the children. And he says, the rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us, the steep climb of everything going up, up as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children, stay together, learn the flowers, and go light. Thank you.
Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you both very much. We are going to open it up for questions from the audience, and I'll ask that you really think about your questions. And we've gotten a lot of information. How do you want to ask it? And while you're thinking, I have a question for the two of them. It's pretty basic. You've given us so much tonight. What are your top 3 ideas, 3 big things that you really want us to take home?
You go first. I knew he was going to do that. In all full disclosure, we had a little bit of a preview that we were going to be asked this question. Not that much, but we had a little bit of time to think about it, so I have been thinking about it. So one idea that I have, and it really plays off a lot of what Tim was talking about, I love the idea of the resiliency hubs, as you call them. I would like to propose that we have a chief resiliency officer for Greater Bend. Could be, situated within the city, with the county, with COIC, with other key institutions, but that we have a place where someone is thinking about the things that Tim has said tonight, about how we make our community more resilient. My feeling is we're going to need that perspective incredibly in the coming years, and it would be nice if we had a dedicated person or office to do that. Another thing I'm thinking about is connectivity. And it's something that Bend lacks a lot of. There's also a lot of thinking about it, a lot of planning, and at the city and county level in terms of how to improve our connectivity, how we get from one place to the other. But as we all know, we live in a divided city physically by the parkway and the railroad. And there's also a proposal for what's called the Drake to Juniper pedestrian bicycle corridor from Drake Park to Juniper Park, going over the new, which we know is going to happen now, Hawthorne overcrossing, which would require that we have kind of a pedestrian Wooner-style zone on probably Minnesota Avenue, so that someday you can walk from the new boardwalk at Drake Park through downtown, over the railroad, over the freeway, past potentially the new city hall that might be located on 3rd Street in the Bend Central District, and end up at Juniper Park. So to me, that's a really visionary thing that we can do to improve our connectivity. The third idea is about inclusion. It's something that I didn't get a chance to talk a lot about tonight. It is a subject of the scanning that we did. It's certainly a subject in one of the 4 major focus areas for the new vision action plan from 2024 to 28 that Envision Bend will be releasing at the end of this week. And one of the ideas, I'm giving a little bit away, Matt, sorry about this, is there's a proposal for a Blue Zone health project here in Bend. And it's something that's very exciting to me. If you haven't heard of the concept of Blue Zone, that all around the planet there are places where people live unusually long and healthy lives. There's a place in Japan, in Greece, in California. Seventh-day Adventist community is one of those Blue Zones. The Blue Zone Community Project is a way to focus our attention as a community so that everybody lives a life where they eat healthy food, they have connection in their life. And I think as we look at becoming a more inclusive community, which we need to do, a Blue Zone Community Project would be a fabulous thing to do here. And guess what? It's in our new plan. So that's my gig.
Great.
Wow. That's good stuff. So my number one is begin to think in systems. This is really important. We do a lot of work in communities, and we do this resource flow mapping thing. And the first couple of times it was an abject failure. And the reason was we told people, we're here to teach you how to think in systems. And everyone got all freaked out, like, I don't have a PhD in physics. I can't think in systems. So we don't do that anymore. We just go in and we explain the rules of the game, which is to think about places where you'd like certain things to happen and then draw an arrow from one thing to another and talk about a resource that would flow there. And at the end of it, we say to them, oh, look at that, you're a system designer, and they're not freaked out. And so it turns out that people, you, are natural systems thinkers. You just don't think you are. And so I would encourage you to rise that up in yourself in everything you're doing, whether it's your work or the way you think about everything in your life. It's all interconnected. And so I would just say begin to really seriously lean into the idea of thinking in systems. And number two, along with that, is de-silo. So I don't know how Bend is in terms of government and institutional and nonprofits. I know in the city of Portland, our government has a problem. Sorry, folks in Portland, if you're going to be watching this, but you know what I'm talking about. It's really siloed. Nobody is going to solve any holistic problem at a systems level from their silos. It's just not going to happen, and you're going to end up with 20th century state-of-the-art stuff, and that's not going to be good enough anymore. So consciously try to de-silo. My third thing was going to be form a civic public-private partnership, but I believe you have those already. Building a better Bend. I just think if you begin to bring together the public and the private and building a better Bend or other organizations and nonprofit, you're probably there. So I'm going to not waste my third choice on that. I'm going to say do whatever it takes to preserve what I think is the most beautiful landscape in North America. You know, I was over at the OSU Cascades and I got teary. It is so gorgeous. And my firm did some of that architecture over there, and I don't even give a rip about the architecture. I care about that landscape. It is so beautiful. And whatever you do, you've got to preserve that sense of place that is so unique to Bend and Central Oregon. I just think it lives right here in Bend. So promise me that you will do that.
Great, thank you. We do have time for one or two questions. If I would ask that you stand and come to the sides, and I'll try to meet you with the mic. Be a little faster that way. We got 1, 2, perfect.
Thank you, ML. Kathy Austin, architect. I sit on the Central Area Advisory Board here for the Central Community and just rolled off 6 years on the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, so I'm very aware of financing challenges, and I'm hoping you're going to say something inspiring about how we can get financial resources to do some of the ideas you had, particularly regarding suburbs and the issues of private ownership versus the kind of systems thinking that you're talking about, and also the crisis in our insurance in resiliency. Thank you.
Well, the good news is that there is beginning to be much more money out there available for these innovative ideas, and I showed you that slide. If I had a fourth thing, it would
Go
be
for it.
to kind of glom on to your idea of a chief resiliency officer and have that person live in the finance world. Because there are a lot of places now that have sustainability coordinators and they have resiliency people. And they tend to be people who are tech nerds, like I am. I'm into the kind of technology. They've got to become finance nerds, because really the most important thing is to begin to raise the capital to make these things happen, because the money is out there. You just need to know how to get it. The Dixie Fire Collaborative was just a bunch of people who got together, and what they issued a call for people who had expertise in various areas. They are raising a ton of money from private foundations. I won't mention who some of them are because they're extremely wealthy individuals who want to do good things. There are corporations out there. There are now beginning to be investment banks that are out there that are, because of this risk issue, that it's now going to be more risky not to do the innovative things I'm talking about, that they now have portfolios where they have to unload money into sustainability. You will not be able to find out about those unless you have someone who knows how to mine those sources for money. And that goes for affordable housing. There are already people who know how to mine those sources for affordable housing, but the infrastructure stuff is really what's coming in the future. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
If I could add just one thing to that,
Sure.
in the work that I've been doing with Envision Bend on the Bend Vision Project, more recently, I've also been working with the Wenatchee Valley up in Washington, in eastern Washington, and the amount of money that they have brought into their community to invest in projects as a result of having a clearly articulated vision for their community and a strategy, a plan to help make it happen, has attracted the kind of money that Tim's talking about. So in addition to the finance people, I think it comes back to the community. If you have a well-articulated idea of where you want to go, everybody wants to put their money behind a winning idea, and so I would add that to it. And with the new vision plan coming out, I think there's a great opportunity to bring a lot of money into the community for affordable housing as well as other things.
Also, I found if you agree to be a model for the rest of the country and go and speak about it after you're successful, suddenly the floodgates open even more. People want their money to not just help you, but to be leveraged to a lot of other like problems everywhere.
We have another question over here we have time for.
Hi, I'm Andy Coughlin. I'm a structural engineer. I serve on the Bend Historic Landmarks Commission also. My question is really a balance between laissez-faire development and regulations related to energy, land use, building height, parking minimums. And if Jane Jacobs said that cities are complex organisms, how could we possibly think that we could master plan to get them to develop into these wonderful, vibrant communities that she describes in her books, or that we want to have in the future? So I just wonder, what is that balance between letting the developers go wild with no height minimums and no regulations, and actually regulating to see what we want to be developed in the land that we have to develop?
That is an excellent question, and I'm actually glad you asked that. Nobody has ever master planned a successful city. Zippo. So Louis Kahn designed Chandigarh in India. It was a master plan. Not many people love it, So I think master plans are not the way of the future. I believe framework plans, and I have to say that we learned so much from our Google experience. And what's happening, I'll just use that as an example. We worked with that company and to a large extent with the public and then the city of Mountain View to find a sweet spot. And we're doing the same with the city of Sunnyvale now. Where is the sweet spot where too much regulation is too much and not enough is not enough? The only way, you can't guess. You have to civic, public, private partnership. You've got to get all the players in the game at the table hashing this out. And they really have to do it in a way that is open and honest, and there has to be a really deep level of trust because certain groups are going to try to game the system, and you don't want that to happen. So, and again, you know, I'm now an infrastructure developer, so I have new empathy for developers. I kind of know how difficult it is, and full disclosure, my wife works for the city of Portland, and she did development reviews for them, and so I've heard the horror stories, and I used to be a planning commissioner in Portland, and so I've heard these things from everywhere, and I just think that zoning's not the answer, laissez-faire is not the answer. I can't tell you exactly what the answer is, but I can tell you a process to figure out the answer, which is get all the people around the table and form some kind of really tight partnership.
Wow, thank you. This is so informative. We are out of time. The conversation doesn't stop here. Please continue thinking and talking and questioning and probing and finding out and testing out. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our guests, Stephen Ames and Tim Smith, for being with us this evening. Please show your appreciation. I would also like to again recognize our title and presenting sponsors, First Interstate Bank and Pinnacle Architecture. Tonight's lecture has been recorded and will be available on our website soon. And we're trying something new tonight. There's a QR code on the screen. You can use that to reach the Building a Better Bend. It sends an email to our organization. We're starting, once we wrap up tonight, we'll be thinking about next year's lecture series. We would love your ideas, speaker suggestions. You know, what it could be something from tonight. It could be something you've been wondering about that the city of Bend needs to kind of grapple with. So Building a Better Bend, we're here to bring ideas and bring experts to the stage. Send us your ideas. We're planning for next year. And I believe that's a wrap. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening.